Does anyone recognize this famous landmark? Events that took place at this luxurious high-rise in Washington, D.C. ultimately led to the downfall of the most powerful man in America. Richard Milhous Nixon served as the 37th president from 1969 to 1974. He is perhaps best known for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. While he accomplished many great things during his presidency, they were overshadowed by this corruption and scandal. Pressure from political allies, friends, and the American public finally convinced him to leave the Oval Office. He became the first president to ever resign from office. Richard Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. His parents were both devout Quakers. He declined a scholarship to Harvard University and attended Whittier College, a local Quaker school, instead. After a brief stint in the Navy, Nixon served in the Congress and Senate. He served as vice president under Eisenhower and ran for president in 1960. However, he was defeated by John F. Kennedy. He was later elected president in 1968. His vice president was Spiro Agnew. When Nixon became president, the United States was in the midst of the Vietnam War. The war successfully ended in 1973 when a peace treaty was signed. The peace treaty withdrew U.S. troops and required the return of all prisoners. Another important foreign policy issue during the Nixon administration was the beginning of peace talks with China. These foreign policy accomplishments were extremely important to the U.S. His most notable domestic action was his association with Watergate. It ultimately led to his downfall. According to USHistory.com, before the summer of 1972, the word Watergate meant nothing more than a luxurious apartment complex in Washington, D.C. It ultimately became known as an infamous political landmark. While doing his rounds at the Watergate Hotel, a night watchman, the Watergate complex, called the police to report a break-in. He noticed that a piece of tape, such as this, was being used to keep doors open throughout the building. After removing them one time, he then came back to discover that it had been replaced. He then alerted police, and Watergate began. At this time, the Watergate complex housed the Democratic National Committee. The police arrested 5 men wearing business suits and latex gloves. They claimed to be repairing wiretapping equipment and were taking pictures of documentation. The men were charged with attempted burglary and attempting to intercept phone and other communications. At their arraignment, Washington Post correspondent Bob Woodward overheard them discussing ties to the CIA and the committee to re-elect President Nixon. Almost immediately, a cover-up was undertaken to protect those involved. It was discovered that those at the highest level of government were involved in the break-in. On November 7, 1972, Nixon was re-elected president in a landslide victory. It was discovered that information obtained in the break-in was used to keep in his re-election campaign. 2 months after his election, the men were indicted in the break-in. During this time, the press was unwilling to be silent and continued to pursue the investigation of Nixon. After his role in Watergate was discovered, he was ultimately forced to resign. He left the Oval Office on August 9, 1974, and became the first president to ever do so. In an unrelated issue, Vice President Spiro Agnew had recently resigned from office. Therefore, Nixon had nominated Gerald Ford to serve as vice president. He was the first president to ever nominate a vice president under the 25th Amendment. When Nixon resigned from office, Ford became president. President Gerald Ford issued a full pardon of Nixon on September 8, 1974. According to HistoryPlace.com, in his speech pardoning Nixon, Ford stated that the trial would cause further degradation to a man who had already paid the ultimate price and relinquished the highest elective office of the United States. Nixon lived for nearly 20 years after his resignation, passing away at the age of 81. In his last years, Nixon gained praise as an elder statesman. His accomplishments as President of the United States were many, from ending the Vietnam War to beginning peace talks with China and the Soviet Union. However, he will be forever remembered as the only president to ever resign from office. His involvement in the Watergate scandal ultimately led to his demise. Watergate forever changed how Americans viewed the executive office, the president, and those with political power. Thank you.